and welcome back to Immigration Ain't Easy. I am honored today to be joined by a name that has become synonymous amongst our network of immigration lawyers, synonymous with the word immigration, um, Ira Kurzban. And the reason for that is anybody who is an immigration lawyer most likely has a copy of one of the 19 editions of it's 19 now, right, Ira?
Yep,
Yep,
19.
19 editions of the immigrant or immigration law Sourcebook, which is a book that Ira started back, was it in the early 90s?
1990,
Wow,
actually.
in 1990. And at that time, the book was maybe the size of a pamphlet.
Right.
And now it's up to two volumes and it's got 2,500 pages of everything you can imagine in the immigration legal world. But anyway, so Ira is a founding partner in the law firm of Kurzban, Tetzelli, and Pratt out of Miami, Florida. He's been a part of that firm for over 40 years. And he also is the past national president and former general counsel of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. I could go on and on with all of the accolades. But one of the more important things I also want to note is that Ira is, um, he's one of those guys who has taken his advocacy for immigrant rights and ratcheted it up and ratcheted it up and ratcheted it up. And now he also, in the last about 15 years, founded or co-founded Immigrants List, which is the first pro-immigrant political action committee in the United States. And so he is just out there doing everything he can to help, immigrants and immigration into the United States. And so I'm really interested to hear a little bit about what motivates you, and we'll talk about that. But before we get started, before I can let Iris speak, I do want to tell a funny story. This might have been about 2016. I'll never forget. I think we were in San Francisco at an AILA, an American Immigration Lawyers Association conference, and I was sitting in a restaurant and I see a guy walking down the street with a hat that looks like a Make America Great Again hat. And I thought this man is going to get the shit kicked out of him. And sure enough, it was Ira wearing a hat that says Make Immigration Great Again. But it looked exactly like a MAGA hat. I mean, way too close. And I was a little bit worried for your safety that week, walking around I guess, San Francisco may not be the place to be walking around with anything that looks like a MAGA hat. But once you get close enough, you could see it. So the nice thing about you is you've got a good sense of humor. You obviously don't care a whole lot about your own safety in the process. So let me ask you, starting from the beginning, what got you into the immigration law field to start off?
Well, actually, I didn't start off as an immigration lawyer. I started off as a civil rights lawyer and a labor lawyer. And that was in part due to Leonard Boudin, who was um, uh, I think, probably the most well known and progressive immigration civil rights lawyer of the 20th century. I mean, many people don't know about Leonard, but if you looked at his history, he argued scores of cases in the Supreme Court. He was the one who established the right to travel cases, all of those cases on having the right to travel nationally or internationally. Leonard did some very famous immigration cases. And those cases involved, the famous Marxist who was trying to come into the United States to speak with American universities and colleges and was denied entry into the country. And Leonard argued the case, saying that there was a First Amendment right. And he did all this from the perspective of something called the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee. Most Americans don't know this, but in the 1950s, unfortunately, the American Civil Liberties Union, which has done great work, as you know, Mo, in the immigration field, particularly over the last 3 decades. But in the 1950s, they were turning in their own members to the McCarthy Committee, during the Red Scare of the 1950s. And so a group of people got together, including the banking partner of J.P. Morgan and others, and formed something called the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee to represent people before the McCarthy Committee, the House Un-American Activities Committees, and argue that people had a First Amendment right to organize and be with and say whatever they wanted to say. And from that point on, the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, which was led by Leonard as their general counsel, took on some of the most important cases in the United States. They did the first comparable worth case in the United States, for example. They did cases involving the Pentagon Papers cases. And so Leonard had the opportunity to argue many times before the Supreme Court. And I met Leonard when I was a student in law school. Leonard came out to speak and actually teach for a semester. We became close friends, and he said, we have these cases in Florida, and that they were actually the two first immigration cases that were class action cases. One was called Marie Pierre versus the United States, and the other was called Marie Sanan versus the United States. And they were cases about Haitians coming by boat and how they were treated when they came to the U.S. in terms of asylum. Most people don't realize that before 1980, we really had no law on political asylum in the United States. We had two things. We had a convention called the the Convention regarding the status of refugees. We became a signatory to the protocol of that refugee convention in 67. But to show you what the law was like in those days, if somebody came by boat in the late 70s, a Haitian came by boat in the mid 70s or late 70s, they would come to the dock and literally the immigration offices would call the State Department and say, what do you want us to do with these people? There was no formal procedure. There was no what we call immigration laws call an I-589, which is the application. And because the only other law that protected people was a law that said if you came from a communist country before 1980, we wouldn't send you back under certain circumstances. It was called withholding of deportation at the time. But the reality was that the Refugee Convention had a very powerful kind of a part, or whatever you want to call it, but a section of the law, and that was the refoulement section. And I think most people, most Americans don't understand the genesis of what that law was and why we became a signatory to the protocol. During the Second World War, Jews and other refugees were fleeing Germany. They would go to the border of Switzerland and be rebuffed and wound up in concentration camps. The famous case involving the St. Louis, the ship that went to Cuba with hundreds of Jewish refugees aboard because they were told they could land and would be safe in Cuba, and Cuba refused to accept them. They then came to the U.S. The U.S. refused to accept them. And Mo, what happened, which is most of these people were killed in concentration camps. They were forced to go back to Germany and to Poland and so forth, and they were ultimately victims. So, in a unified way, by the 1950s, the world community said, we will never allow this to happen again. We will not allow people to come to borders who are seeking asylum, who are fleeing for their lives. We will never turn them away. We will never shut our borders as Switzerland did and Cuba did at the time and so forth. And the irony, of course, is we live in a world today where it's almost accepted, in Trump world, it's accepted that we can close the borders. But that's exactly what the Swiss and the others did. That was the genesis of this law. So I got into this in kind of a peculiar way, which was after I graduated, Leonard said, would you like to go to Florida and be our counsel for the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee? And at the same time, my brother was practicing law down here. And, in terms of my background, my father left his country when he was 12 years old on his own because of anti-Semitism. On his own.
Which country did he leave?
Romania. And he went ultimately to Belgium, worked in a factory as a 13-year-old kid. And then eventually he went to Montreal and came to the US. So I've always had that, very strong feelings about both anti-Semitism, but also how you treat refugees who come to the borders of your country. So when those 12-year-old kids were coming from the Northern Triangle, coming to the border of the southern border of the United States and were being turned around, I could identify with that directly because, that was my family. My family, at least on my father's side, had to leave and flee their country. And, thank goodness there was a time in which they could come to America, where the borders and where Americans had a very different view. So that's how it started. I came to Florida. I was doing civil rights work, police brutality cases. I represented Native Americans in their efforts to get land back, and a bunch of interesting cases. And then something dramatic happened, which is by the late 70s, I got to Miami on December 31st, 1976. And of course, my friends in Berkeley and Northern California thought I was insane to go to Florida. There was really nothing. Florida was kind of a dead city. I mean, most people don't realize it, but by the 1970s, there was no tourism. The city was a dead city in many, many respects. And this was before the emergence of really the Cuban community opening up Miami to the gateways of Latin America. And so people were like scratching their head, why would I go there? There were two civil rights lawyers in Florida at the time, really. I mean, two major civil rights lawyers, and that was it in the entire state of Florida. And, when you think about it, it wasn't much long after desegregation, right? I mean, this was the late 70s. I was asked at that point by the National Council of Churches and the Christian Community Service Agency to start representing Haitians. And I had two very vivid memories. One was going to what we used to call mass hearings. You may remember those, Mo, or they may have even been before your time.
It was before my time.
Yeah, they were called mass hearings, multiple accelerated hearings. They'd bring 30 Haitians into a room and say, who wants to be deported? And the people wouldn't speak English. They didn't know what was going on. If they raised their hand, they were deported. And I said, as a civil rights lawyer, there's got to be something wrong with this. There's something wrong with this picture. And then the second thing was I got very involved with the Haitian community in general. And we started, I became the general counsel for the Haitian refugee center in Miami. And eventually, Father Gerard Jean Just, who I kind of regard as the Martin Luther King, really, of the Haitian community, he eventually died as a result of first being in prison in Haiti because he went back to Haiti when they had democratically elected governments, and then there was a coup. But he asked me to go and represent a 14-year-old girl who was detained. And that really had a life changing experience for me because when we think about people being detained, you think about criminals generally, people who were serving a criminal sentence. Um, and I think most Americans also don't realize this that before 1980, it was not the policy of the United States to detain immigrants coming to the country, period. I mean, they would detain in the 50s. Sometimes they detained people who they thought were members of the Communist Party, and sometimes, obviously, if they thought somebody was a terrorist or really posed a serious threat. But the idea of just detaining people who were seeking freedom in the country was unknown to the American immigration system until the beginning of the 1980s, the late 70s, the beginning of the 1980s. And so, Father Jean Just asked me, can you go out? And I saw this 14-year-old girl alone in a jail cell in West Palm Beach. And I can still see her face today. She ultimately, of course, got released and she became a teacher here in South Florida and had a successful career as a teacher. But it, really left a kind of a shocking visual impact on me that I will never forget. And that's one of the reasons why I became so deeply involved in the struggle for Haitians, because what happened in Florida was something that was clearly discriminatory. Cubans were coming in, they were treated completely different than Haitians. Cubans were not detained, they were released. Haitians would come in and they would eventually be incarcerated, and the government would try and get them out of the country. So that sharp difference, kind of set me off in the sense that, this was not something that we as Americans grew up to believe in. We believe in equal
Equal
treatment.
rights, yeah.
Right. Whether you like people or don't like people, you don't treat one group different than the other. And it was so clear and so stark that we began to bring lawsuits. And many of the issues that you hear about today, detention, that these people are migrants, they're not really refugees, same issues in the late 70s, early 80s.
It seems like the rhetoric hasn't changed at all either. I mean, when we see that, Trump and his supporters are out there, calling Haitians dog and cat eaters, and it's the same nonsense over and over again.
Right. I actually think Trump has some kind of weird psychological problem with Haitians. And I said, well, maybe he had a Haitian girlfriend who just rebuffed him or something. I can't figure out what
There's
it
no
is.
way he had a black girlfriend.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
sorry.
probably right.
Maybe in his weird, twisted mind, but I don't think in real life. I mean,
But he has this visceral hatred for Haitians that I
yeah.
can't even quite understand. But nevertheless, there's been this history. Even in his the first iteration, Trump won. They took away the H-2A and H-2B program for Haitians. They terminated TPS. He really went after Haitian, called Haiti a shithole country. The whole nine
Yeah.
yards at the time. And of course, they're doing the same thing. He just thinks they're an easy target. He's a bully, so bullies look for easy targets. What's an easier target than black refugees?
And
And
when you look at Haiti as, as a like an island nation and what they've had to go through with coups, with, horrible government, and then earthquake and hurricanes. It's like one thing after another with that poor country, and their poor citizens have to deal with this. It's just awful. I mean, to me, they're the lowest hanging fruit for a person like Trump to go after,
Yeah, I think that's right. Without getting sidetracked too much, Haiti has had this incredible history, of course. Haiti was the first democratic republic, black republic. It's the one of the very few countries that overthrew slavery on its own, and in 1801 declared itself as a democratic, independent republic, and became a beacon. And I think maybe that's why all the rest of the world is, kind of uh, the in Africa and Latin America, Haiti is hailed as this incredible country that actually overthrew slavery and established its own republic. And yet the United States did not recognize Haiti until the Civil War in 1863, and did it for political reasons. We refused to recognize Haiti because we were afraid that we were going to have our own slave revolt in the US, where the rest of the world looked at Haiti as this glorious country that did something that's really unique. And even to this day, that's true. I mean, even with all the problems, the Haitian history is such a powerful beacon, I think, for many other countries of the world. And without getting into too much of it, I'll tell you just one story. When they say Haiti is a failed state, I want to remind Americans that in 1915, we sent troops into Haiti, went into their national bank, and took out all the gold to give it to Citibank of New York. I mean, there's a whole history behind why Haiti was so indebted and so poor and so forth. It's not just by chance. But putting that aside, so I'm representing Haitian refugees. It's the late 70s or early 80s. The government is taking the same position. Again, these are just migrants, they're not really refugees. Of course, the Duvaliers were in power in Haiti, and they were vicious and authoritarian, and had executed many people. The first wave of Haitians went to Brooklyn, New York, actually, in the early 70s, when Papa Doc Duvalier in the 60s and early 70s was in power. Then his son took over, Baby
Was
Doc.
that Jean Claude?
Jean-Claude Duvalier. We used to call him Baby Doc Duvalier. And so our goal, just strategically, in terms of what we were trying to do, is to show the American people that, number one, what the conditions were in Haiti, that these people weren't just fleeing, because they wanted a better job. They were fleeing because of the concrete conditions. That's why they were refugees, because of the political conditions. And at the same time, we began to establish rights for Asians. For example, most immigration lawyers don't know, Mo, that the first regulations involving employment authorization came as a result of a lawsuit that we did on behalf of Haitians. Before the late 1970s, there were no employment authorization regulations. We went to court and said if people are seeking asylum, they have to have some way of staying here. They have to have some basis to remain in the US. So we sued, and as a result, the government issued the first employment regulations. They were at 8 CFR 108. Those were the first regulations. The same thing with detention. Haitians were the first group to challenge their detention. And that was a case that, ultimately went to the U.S. Supreme Court, John V. Nelson, where we argued that, whether you think people should be detained or not, you can't detain black people and people based on their national origin and let everyone else go. And, in the course of that case, we hired statisticians and others, And we demonstrated that the chances of Haitians being detained and everyone else being released, because remember, the government was saying, oh, this is just by chance. And the statistician said it was like flipping a coin and getting heads 1 billion times in a row. So we pretty conclusively
Yeah.
established. And then we found the smoking gun, which you never find in cases where we found the government had a Haitian program.
Yeah.
We called it the Haitian program. And you may remember, we went after the government on that as well.
So when you're filing all this litigation, at that time, was it funded through a foundation? Like, how did you get funded for all this high impact litigation back then?
We did. We did it all pro bono.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, we spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars and hours, and tens of thousands of dollars in costs. We just felt very strongly about it, and then, thank goodness, at least on one case, they established the Equal Access to Justice Act, which they never imagined was going to be used
So,
for refugees. They thought it was
yeah.
only for businesses suing the government. And that was one of the other cases that wound up in the Supreme Court, Commissioner versus Gene.
And anyone who's listening, so that's a situation where the government would have to reimburse the costs of litigation for a plaintiff or plaintiffs if they lose the case in the federal court.
Yeah, and if we can show that they were not, they have to show they were substantially justified in defending it. And if they can't, then we're entitled to fees. And I will tell you, during Jean V. Nelson, which was the basis for the fee award, the government's attorney, and this is something I think for everyone who listens to your podcast should know, the lawyer for the government quit in the middle of the case. He said that he couldn't take the moral improprieties of what the government was doing to Haitians. He couldn't defend it any longer. And that's why I say to people, when we started in Miami, there was no Haitian community. The Haitians were coming by boat. The entire rest of the community wanted them gone. They went to the federal government. The federal government was trying to get them out. So you had all these forces aligned against the Haitians. And yet, through people going in the street, and that's why I said before, Father Gerard Jean-Jus, who was like Martin Luther King, every week there were demonstrations in the streets in Miami. We'd go to the courthouse, there'd be 300 people, accompanying us to the courthouse. And so, people created this groundswell of it's not fair the way the Haitians are treated.
And it's interesting. I would just say that that lawyer, somehow found his conscience in this middle of this case when you look at the ridiculous arguments that the Trump's administration's lawyers were making on the birthright citizenship,
Right.
Like making arguments on behalf of the government that are completely nonsensical. I think, it treads on being unethical and,
Yeah.
in different
Well, I
capacities.
think, they do what they're going to do, but I think a lot of them don't believe in it. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? And I think at some point it gets to people where you have to stand up and say,
Enough.
somebody who was born
Yeah.
in the United States is not an American citizen. I mean, you
It's
know,
crazy.
so our hope is that the Supreme Court sees it the same
Yeah.
way. But that's
So let me ask you then, when did you start to merge into, so like when you started, it was basically just known as primarily like civil rights lawyers. Like we didn't have a niche of immigration lawyers. It wasn't really a carve out like we see now. At what time did you see your own work or practice kind of merge into more of a immigration focused law practice?
Great question. So I have to tell you some funny stories. Like my former wife was an immigration lawyer, who you know, and I would call and say, "What's an I-94?" I mean, when you're a civil rights lawyer and you're doing this from a civil rights perspective, you really don't know very much about immigration law. But I think as a result of the cases, and they were very high profile, at one point the OAS, in Jean V. Nelson, the OAS went to the Chrome Detention Center. So some of these cases were not only national, they became internationally known. And so people started to call, as they would, normally, and say, "Oh, I have this other problem." And I didn't know very much about immigration. And I'd say, really, I didn't really become an immigration lawyer in that sense, I'd say, until the late 80s.
Mhm.
So I was starting in the 70s, and maybe by 85, 86, 87, I started to develop a practice. But my former wife used to make fun of me because I had to move my office at one point, and it was one drawer of files.
That's,
so, so
different from what you wound up in.
right.
Did you ever travel to Haiti, or did you go to Haiti at all?
Well, I represented the Democratic, when Haiti had democratic elections from 1991 to 2004. As a result of the work I had done on behalf of Haitian refugees, the Haitian government asked me to represent them. So
You
I
did a
was
lot.
I was the attorney for Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was the first elected president, and then Preval, who was democratically elected after him, and then Aristide again, and then the second coup happened in 2004 against Aristide. And I mean, that's a whole other thing we can do. We can do a podcast.
Another podcast on
That's a
that.
different life. I mean,
Yeah.
I could tell you stories that would actually shock you about what the United States did. When Trump started in 2016, and the whole disinformation campaign, my response was, the chickens have come home to roost, because that's something we've been doing in other countries for years and years. They ran an entire disinformation campaign against Aristide, saying he was crazy, he was in a mental hospital, he was this and that, he stole money. None of it was true. It was all done through what they call psyops, and I found it very interesting, and this is the last thing I'll say about Haiti now. I found it very interesting that that this religious group that was supporting Trump, um, that they use that language, that, that we're developing psyops, because the military had this whole disinformation campaign, which we run in a number of countries. And I'm sure we're still doing that today, but they did it against Haiti. And, eventually it came back here. And that's what we have now, sustained disinformation campaigns. Very hard to undo.
Yeah, it's tragic when you look at, the fact that we are going through the same cycle of disinformation that so many once proud nations had, had to go through, and it's very hard, like you said, to recover from, because it just becomes a complete, cult. You end up with people who believe anything they hear, even if it's not factual. It's
Right.
crazy.
And
Um,
that's, when the group I was thinking of was QAnon.
oh,
And
QAnon,
QAnon,
yeah.
the leader of it spoke. Watching documentaries, one of the guys who was involved, he was a person who had a psyops background. So it's not surprising to me that they would use the same tactics, and that's what happened here. I mean,
So let me just shift gears and talk a little bit about the immigration law source book for a minute.
sure.
So, Why don't you tell me a little bit about the genesis of how that book came about and how you wound up becoming the author of this book and, now 19 editions later, 34 years later, or almost it's 35 now. Um, you know, could you ever envision it going to the places that it's been? I mean, to the extent where pretty much any DHS office has a copy of the book now. And I've gone into other, ICE attorneys' offices and they have the book.
Yeah.
So where did the idea come from, and how did you end up being the author of it?
Well, I started teaching immigration law at the University of Miami and at Nova Law School in the 80s. And and I would have an outline for the course. And it was a very thin outline, as you point out. The first edition of the book was in big print, about 300 pages. It's now close to 3,000 in two volumes, in very small print,
Yes.
very thin
Very
paper.
thin pages. They're
Right,
like tissue paper.
right. So again, my former wife said, why don't you publish this? And you know me long enough to know my response was, who would want to read this crap? So um, and so she said, no, people would, they'd really benefit by it and so forth. So that's how the first volume got published. And Ayla, I decided I could have gone the West or the others, but I decided to do it with the American Immigration Lawyers Association because I wanted them to get the financial
Benefit it. Yeah.
benefit of it if it was successful. But I have to tell you, I never, ever, ever imagined that it would be as successful as it's become. I mean, it's what you said. I mean, all the immigration lawyers use it. Most of the immigration judges have it. Many of the immigration officers, DHS people have it. And I never could have imagined that it would take so much work and so much energy. I think the other thing people don't realize is how much time it takes. I mean, it was, today it takes about 15 to 2,000 hours a year to do the book.
And when we're looking at, I mean, if you just look at the acknowledgments, there's so many different individuals that end up now having to pitch in on the editing and review of it because
Right.
of all the constant changes in case law and memos and I mean, it's just, the last edition probably talked about how the COVID vaccine is required. Now, if a new edition came out, there is no requirement for a COVID vaccine. So you have to take that out of there.
Right. You got to take it out. Exactly. I mean, Trump, between Trump and the rest of the world, every other edition, it's like ping pong. You have to take something out, put it back in. Look what he did this week. I mean, he said every single executive order written by Biden on immigration is now gone. And all those are in the 19th edition. So you're going to have to take them out of the 19th, and put in whatever they're going to do with all his new crazy executive orders. So, yeah, I mean, it's a big job. And as you point out, people like yourself and others have been extremely helpful because I try to do it all myself. It can't be done. At the end of the process, I turned it over to experts like Mo and yourself and other people, and they kind of mark it up and get it back to me. And we have to try and do it all in like 1 month, given all the people's comments and everything. And each year, because the book gets bigger and bigger, it gets more and more difficult. I mean, the first six issues, first six editions, I would say 8 editions were not that difficult. But the more and more, because I used to do everything at the beginning, I did the index, I did everything else. and it's not possible to do any more for one person. And the next edition, which may be my personal last edition, we're going to have three new people work with me on it who are, just terrific writers and lawyers. So I'm very.
So let me ask. I guess I should ask since this is my podcast, so I can ask questions. Um, I'm like, let me ask you a question, sir. So, how? I mean, from a time management perspective, you have your hands in a lot of different, so to speak, cookie jars. You're dealing with always having to put out a new edition of this book every, was it every other year?
Yeah, every 2 years.
You have Immigrants List, your political action committee. You've served on other, boards of organizations, and you also have a law practice, and you do, still, represent individuals and do legal work. What, I mean, as far as time goes, do you have any time for your own self and be able to, I mean, it almost seems like superhuman that you could do all these things and do it all quite well, I should say, and still be there smiling.
Well, I exercise every morning. I go out and either walk for a couple of miles or I go to the gym. And so I do that. But, this is mostly my life. And I have to say, I've always worked 6 days a week, always. When my kids were little, I took off on the weekends, but now I work 7 days. I mean, it just, if I go out, I go out, but it's really my life in many, many respects. So I guess in that sense, I don't have much of a.
I mean, you mentioned also that image of that girl, and it seems like that was a precursor to what we saw when the children were held, even under Obama and then
Yeah.
under Trump, in the cages and the separating them from their families. In your career thus far, and you still have a long ways to go,
Well, I
but
don't
in
know.
your career thus far, are there any cases that you've worked on, that may not be like a high impact litigation case like what you dealt with the Haitian government and so forth? Was there ever a case where you walked away and just felt extra fulfilled by doing a case that you were able to help an individual or individuals? And what were the facts of that case that might stick out in your mind?
Well, I hate to tell you, but it's just the opposite. It's the ones that you lost that you
Yeah,
feel
that's true.
terrible about, and
Mhm.
ironically, I saw a member of somebody's family on Sunday, and one of the cases that really stuck out was Ralph Richardson's case, which I tried to take to the Supreme Court. The court turned it down. It was a case at one point where they abolished the writ of habeas corpus. And it was this concept that I just couldn't wrap my head around. So I kept fighting for this guy all the way, in district court and the Court of Appeals. Then saw it in an emergency stay from the Supreme Court. I think it was Justice Kennedy. And they didn't grant it. And I personally went with him back to Haiti. He's from Haiti, even though his name was Richardson. But it was, you remember, and you know this, I think, too. You remember some of the ones that you lost more than the ones that you won. In terms of the ones that I won, I think the big class action cases, we represented 200,000 farm workers in McNary. Those cases I remember because there were also individuals involved. Jean V. Nelson, I remember Nelson. Yeah, I remember Marie Lucy Jean in that case because I went to visit her in detention. She was the named plaintiff, and she had had a nervous breakdown in detention. There were in Jean V. Nelson, three people committed suicide in the course of that case. People don't realize the impact of incarceration. I mean, if you've never been incarcerated, you don't really have a sense of it, I think. But remember, these are people who are coming to the United States because, as Reagan said, this was the beacon on the hill. This was the place where people can seek freedom, and all of a sudden they find themselves incarcerated. Not only, you can call it detained, they can try and use whatever language they want, but the reality is people in jail, they are in immigration prison. You can, fancy it up any way you want, and they're treated like prisoners.
And I remember early in my career reading about the conditions of Chrome and
Right.
how horrible the conditions were there, to the extent where one of our clients that wound up in Arizona was complaining so much about Chrome, they shipped him all the way out to Eloy. They
Right.
were like, all right, we'll send you to Eloy, Arizona.
Right. You want it bad? Here's
Yeah.
even less
You
bad.
don't like it here? We'll send you there. And I mean, he was complaining pretty widely and openly in the papers. So I think at the time, INS was pretty sick of the guy. But so I mean, dealing with loss, which we deal with, and a lot of times it's beyond our control because of the the not only the gravity of the cases and the stakes are so high because you're talking a lot of time about people who could be potentially deported to their death. um how, like, when I have lawyers who are just getting into this, I think they go in excited to fight the good fight, and then they, a lot of times come to that realization that, there's so many variables that they have no control over: who the judge is, what are the policies of ICE at the time, the 96 immigration law and all the different changes. I mean, even all the way up to the Biden administration with the CBP1 app and circumvention of lawful pathways. I, how does somebody who's getting into this area of law now, in your opinion, get over that, the shock of, a lot of loss that you end up having to deal with, and a lot of it is totally beyond your control. You could be the greatest lawyer and advocate in the world, and the cruelty of our immigration system is going to defeat your client.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to have a couple of things. One is you do have to have the technical skills because sometimes you get people who are really revved up but don't have the technical skills and don't want to spend the time, developing those technical skills. So the technical skills are very important. Most people don't realize, as you know, more with it, immigration's like tax law in a lot of ways. It's very, very complicated, very,
Get
minute.
everything checked
I
off, and yeah.
Yeah, but I've always had this inner sense of if you're fighting the good fight, if you're doing what's right, that's going to carry you through, and your clients are going to know that you never gave up on them. Even the cases I've lost, the clients have always been appreciative because they know we never gave up. And you got to have that internally. You got to realize you're fighting. If you weren't there, these people would have no representation. They'd just be treated even worse than they are now. At least, you're kind of the front lines of those battles. But I will tell you, the people who do the legal services work, the people on the front lines in Texas and in Florida and Arizona, to me, I think those are the real heroes of our profession. I mean, I really do. And I've always told them that. I think the people who deserve the most credit are not the people like me who do these high profile cases, but people who are there every day slogging through, asylum cases where they're up against judges who have a 98% denial rate, that kind of thing. But you have to have that kind of internal fortitude to understand, you're on the right side of history. And I've always told them that the lawyers in my office too, we're on the right side. I don't care what Trump does. I don't care if he terrorizes people and does what he's trying to do to terrorize them and so forth. We're going to fight him, and we're not going to be afraid. We're not going to back down. We're not going to be terrorized because we're right. And we're right in defending these people whose only crime is seeking freedom. They're talking about going after the
The
criminals.
criminals. Yeah.
They can't even find enough. If they went after only the criminals, it'd be over next week. This is the great lie, and as you know, and I know, and every immigration lawyer knows, who are the so-called criminals? Those are people already in jail. They're getting out of jail. They put a detainer on them, and those are the people who, for the most part, are gone anyway. The people they're talking about are criminals. First of all, don't exist, but to the extent that there are a few of them out there, their felonies are driving without a license in Florida. Why are they driving without a license? Because they're trying to get to work. They can't get a license because of the way the law is, so they go and drive and they get caught. They're now a felon. Those are the criminals that Trump is talking about.
And that, I mean, it really goes to show why the Lake and Riley Act had such a low bar for what would be considered, somebody who should be mandatorily detained, which is, not, first of all, no conviction, only an allegation, and nonviolent,
Right.
offenses like shoplifting or theft that
Right.
have not even been proven in a court of law. So, I mean, the reality is when they say criminal, that's basically just, a dog whistle to everyone saying, it's the same thing as saying they're an invasion and they're illegals. It's almost like the word criminal has become pejorative in a sense when you're speaking about an immigrant now, because they are all criminals according to the people who,
Right.
who
And
believe everything he
part of the
says.
problem is, and this gets to Immigrants List too, I
Yeah.
think. We started Immigrants List in 2006 with the idea of trying to get people elected who are pro-immigration in the U.S., the PAC side, and then the other side, which is Immigrants List Civic Action Inc. We do education in immigrant communities in their own languages to inform people as to who are the candidates and so forth. The worst thing that can happen, and the thing that we're starting to see now, is not just the crazy MAGA people doing what they're doing in terms of mischaracterizing, misinformation about the situation, Haitians eating cats and dogs. It's the rest of the community that's not responding to it. I think that the shame of Lincoln Riley, it was horrible what happened to that young woman, but it was one Venezuelan out of 1.4 million people. You're always going to find bad people in any group under any circumstances. You're always going to find criminals who have done certain things. But we know as immigration lawyers that immigrant communities have the lowest crime rates of any groups in the United States, including Americans who are here and so forth. So to have that situation and to have Democrats, 48 Democrats in the House, 18 Democrats in the Senate voted for that. Your senator was a co-sponsor of the bill. It's outrageous. I mean, in other words, it's not so much that the MAGA people and Trump are character doing what they're doing. It's that the other people are not coming forward and saying this is nonsense. Yes, we have to have an orderly process at the border, but these people, the Congressional Budget Office, right, in last February, said these people coming across the border, the ones that they're calling criminals and rapists and everything else, they're going to contribute $9 trillion to our economy over the next decade. That's the Congressional Budget Office. That's not me, and that's not you. They're going to reduce the deficit of the United States by $1 trillion. Now, why aren't the Democrats saying that? Why aren't they coming out there? Everyone knows if Trump could actually deport all the people he's saying, which we all know he can't. We all know this is all just a terrorist act. It's a mirage. But if he could, the economy of the United States would collapse. Everybody knows that. I mean, if it's agriculture, if it's construction, if it's the service industry, whatever it is, we couldn't operate this economy without those 1.4 million people who Biden intelligently gave work authorizations to.
When you speak about the Democratic Party and the way they seem to, you know, give in to the Republicans on these types of issues, I mean, do you look at, for example, Immigrants List as a pack? I mean, and wonder, like, are we being successful in getting these people elected and helping? Because I'm sure some of the people who we've supported were in favor of and voted for Lake and Riley. I know that for a fact. I mean, what is your thought on that? Do you feel like there's some betrayal there, or what are your thoughts?
I think there is. I don't know if I'd call it betrayal. I mean, I think it's clear that even if you support people, you don't always expect them to vote the way
Exactly.
you would
Yeah.
like them to vote. And I think that's realistic. But I am shocked to see, I have to say, some of the names that were on that list in the House and some of the names that were on the list in the Senate, people who we really went to bat for in the last election, really supported, said they were pro immigration. So obviously, we're not going to be doing very much more work for those people. But there are people, and we've had a very good success rate. I think up until this election of electing 75% of the people, and some of them are really pro-immigration. You got people like Delia Ramirez in Chicago, Greg Cesar in Texas. These are people who are really pro-immigration, and they're not going to back down. I
And
mean,
you honored J.B. Pritzker a couple of
right?
summers ago,
And
and look
that's
at
right.
him. He's out there, putting up a good fight. So, I mean, as far as the profile of Immigrants List, it seems like it's really risen over the last decade. Would you agree? And do you see it, going? I don't know why I see bubbles on my face because I raised my. Did you see the bubbles pop up? It, it's a visual thing. I don't know why that happened, but I've got, like when you have bubbles coming out of your brain in a comic strip. So, yeah, I mean, talk a little bit about Immigrants List and the growth of it, and what do you see the future of the organization looking like over the next 4 years and beyond?
Yeah, as I said, we started in 2006. It was started by a group of immigration lawyers because we realized that this was pre Trump, obviously. We realized in 1996, Congress had passed this horrible law that says we have mandatory detention for the first time in America. It said you couldn't sue the government 17 different ways if you wanted to bring a lawsuit. It said that there's something called the 3 and 10 year bar, which Mo and every immigration lawyer knows about. It's kind of complex to explain it, but I'll try to do it in a very short period. Before 1996, if somebody was here illegally, you could make them legal. In other words, if you wanted to do the right thing and make them legal, the only penalty was at the end of the process, they had to go home, pick up their immigrant visa and come back. So I used to get calls from senators, from federal judges who said, somebody's taking care of my elderly parent and they're not here legally. I want to do the right thing. I want to make them legal, and you could do it. After 1996, they passed something called the 3 and 10 year bar, which basically says at the end of that process, when they have to go home, the day they step out of the United States, they can't come back for 10 years, which is why, and this was this was engineered by Republicans in secret, really. And then, unfortunately, Bill Clinton signed it. But the bill basically really created the so called 10 million or whatever numbers of people, because most of those people before 1996, we would make residents. They could become residents and doing it through the legal process. So you can't do that anymore. So we started Immigrants List with the idea of changing the law, getting people elected who understood, who would learn or understood the complexities of these laws and getting them changed. None of us could have imagined Trump at the time, and doing what he did and turning around the whole, kind of cycle about what immigrants are and who they are and so forth. So what we have done, we not only have the PAC, which supports certain candidates, we also have something called Immigrants List Civic Action Inc. And Civic Action Inc. goes into communities, whether it's the Filipino community in Las Vegas, it's the Hispanic communities in Arizona and Texas, it's the Haitian community in Florida, it's the Chinese community on the outer ring of Atlanta, and so forth. People don't realize there are lots of immigrant communities where there are people who are American citizens who can vote. And they're often what we call low propensity voters. In other words, they don't have real knowledge of what's going on. They don't pay attention very often to the process. And they usually vote like in the last few days of make a decision in the last few days of the election. That's why people didn't know what was really going to happen in this election. So in this last election, 2024, we went into the 7 states, right? Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, North Carolina, and so forth, the 7 states that were going to make a difference in the election, Nevada. And we went into the immigrant communities and we, had people go door to door, but mostly did with the limited resources we had in language information about the election, what the positions were, the candidates, and so forth, and what people should do. And we believe in that model because we believe it's important to educate people. But I think, in light of the endless stream of misinformation in the social media sphere, that we really have to take a closer look at that. And things like what you're doing, Mo, are extremely important because if you look at social media, 40% of young people are getting their news from TikTok. So I didn't even know what TikTok was, and I'm 75, so I started my first TikTok last week.
Got to
But
start sometime.
you got to do it sometime. So the bottom line is, things like what you're doing and our talk today, and getting people to understand that immigrants are not criminals, they're not takers as they think. Immigrants pay hundreds of billions of dollars in taxes every year in the United States. Okay. And on the other side, understanding that Trump's program is going to cost the American people hundreds of billions of dollars. And where is it all going? It's developing a new, like the military industrial complex, it's developing the immigration industrial complex. That's why private companies like Geo and Core Civic, they're all salivating over what Trump's doing. Everybody's getting into the detention business now because they want to get a share of the pie just to detain people. And who are we detaining? I mean, it costs us a fortune to
Yeah.
detain people.
Doesn't it's like $160 per person a day, right? Per
Right. And
detainee.
right, and it's not only that. So why are they putting in the law mandatory detention? Because they know that these people pose no threat to the public, are not likely to abscond, which are the two major bases for
Keeping
releasing
them.
people.
Yeah, or
So the
releasing
more
them.
mandatory, the more people have to be in detention. So those are the kind of things we want to do to educate people, particularly in the immigrant communities. And I think our challenge is raising the kinds of money that we need. It's always a problem. So please have people go on www.immigrantsList.org, make a contribution, and look at the stuff we're doing. We're putting out something every week now about everything that Trump's doing and what the effects are and so forth.
As part of posting this interview, I'll make sure to have that link up, and as part of the description of the episode, the podcast episode. So, when we're talking about getting information out to different communities, you're also talking about different languages and having to get past those language barriers. And I think one of the frustrations of being in the pro-immigrant sphere is that we do not have, for lack of a better way to describe it, the advantage of fear-based uh, promotions, which is when you look at FAIR or Numbers USA or some of those other organizations, the Center for Immigrant Studies, they can really, dive into people's pocketbooks with fear-based ads and getting, stories and blogs out there that just try to frighten people into submission. And I think that does, serve as an advantage, a huge advantage when they're trying to collect money.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. It makes it much harder. On the anti immigrant side, they've always had a huge amount of money and they've always had big donors. And you don't find that really on the pro immigration side because the Democratic establishment, I have to say, is unfortunately never wholeheartedly endorsed pro-immigration policies. I mean, they should, lean into it, as they say, right? I mean, we as immigration lawyers understand what it takes for somebody to leave their country and come to the United States. Most people think, oh, they just want to come and it's a free ride. I mean, for your listeners who are not lawyers, they should think about if they had to leave the United States, what it would take for them to go to another country. I mean, psychologically, it's very, very difficult. So, this notion that they sell what they're selling on the other side is they're all takers, they're all criminals, they're all, and they're going to come after you and they're going to come after your job. I mean, to me, the most outrageous thing is Trump actually saying they're taking jobs from Americans because even the most anti immigrant people weren't saying that because they knew how ridiculous it was. I mean, we have a 4 million job shortage in the United States right now. If he gets rid of those people, we're going to have even more of a shortage. So, yes, they can do it on fear, but we have to do it. What happens is, Mo, as you know, the pendulum swings both ways. And I think what's happening is there was an interesting poll this week that said, yeah, Americans want to stop people at the border and they want an orderly immigration, but they don't approve of Trump's tactics. And so when they start going to the condominiums of wealthy people and demanding that they be let in, and they start going to regular communities and they see their neighbor who's this guy who gets up at 6 in the morning and works his butt off until 7 at night being pulled out of his house and his kids are crying in the driveway, people are going to start to understand what this policy is.
And I think you are not only a brilliant person, but you're telepathic, because I was exactly, like, literally the moment you said that, going to ask you, do you think Trump is overplaying his hand, and that his obstinance and unwillingness to pull back from this type of policy and ideology is going to end up backfiring on this administration at some point? I think so. I think you just said it. I mean, they're going to start to get into those supporters. I mean, we saw the story, I think it was a couple weeks ago, from a guy who owns tomato farms. And he owns like 4,000 acres of tomato farms, and he voted for Trump. And now he's, you know, it sounds like having a little bit of buyer's remorse because he's afraid of how it's going to impact his bottom line. And I think once that starts to happen, it starts to impact them, those individuals individually. That's when we're going to start to see, a lot of this buyer's remorse coming out.
Well, it's also, the price of eggs, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they say, oh, that's why Biden lost the price of eggs. I mean, can you imagine if they really go through this program of deporting these people? The price of eggs, the price, you'll have a $5 tomato. I mean, people don't understand that there's always been this balance of trying to figure out how to get workers on the one hand, how to keep the prices stabilized on the other. And this is a guy who's just saying, I don't care about it because he's a billionaire. What does he care? He's surrounded by billionaires. So what's the difference? I'm just going to get rid of all these immigrants because I hate them. He's got some psychological issue. Let's get rid of them. And the price of tomatoes, the price of eggs, the price of everything is going to start to go up. And if people haven't seen inflation before, wait. So I think you're absolutely right about what's going to happen. There's no doubt that once they start doing this on a regular basis, people are going to see it, and it's been hidden from them really. And now they're going to have to confront it. They're going to have to understand what this policy means. I mean, look what he did with Colombia this week. The Colombian president said, "I'm not going to take 60 people back," and Trump almost dropped the nuclear weapon on Colombia. I mean, he said, "No visas for anybody. No, we're closing down the embassy." I mean, it was, and the problem is, and this is what's scary, there are no guardrails anymore.
Yeah. So diplomatic relations are going to be,
Yeah, but with not only
beyond strained.
diplomatically later, who knows what he's going to do with nuclear weapons? Who knows what he's going to do with the military? He's got a Hegseth in there who, is not exactly a person who is going to stand up to Trump. Number one, when Trump says, send, 5,000 American troops into Chicago because I don't like what the governor has done. And when people start to see that, that's when it's going to really start to backfire, I think.
Do you think we'll see it backfiring before the midterms?
Well, as somebody on Immigrants List, I would say I hope so.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. And in your eyes, I mean, do you see any sort of silver lining to what we're up against right now? I mean, is there any sort of hope? I know that you and I have gone to Capitol Hill. You've gone to Capitol Hill, you know, God, dozens and dozens of times and spoken to legislators and tried to push for, smart immigration reforms. Do you think any of this will lead eventually to some, smart reforms? I think my biggest fear is that we will get some good reforms in place, but it's going to be a trade-off with some really, really bad ones.
I think your instincts are right, but I think also we need to have people have backbones. You know a lot about the period between 1933 and
Mhm.
1936 in Germany. And and Hitler was able to do what he did, not so much because the German people were all in favor of it, but people just didn't stand up. The industrialists supported Hitler. The as you have Musk and all these other people now, or they're not. They're backing down. People need to stand up. I mean, and if they don't stand up, we're going to have a very, very serious problem in the U.S.
What
I
would you say? And you may have gotten inquiries from people who don't do immigration law or may not have been involved with the immigration advocacy world before. What would you say to people these days that are now wanting to get involved? Like what sort of recommendations would you have to them so that they can feel like they could help out? And I mean, I'd be interested to hear, where people should either, give obviously to Immigrants List is one, but also like just how can they support their local immigrants and local immigrant communities?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. The old kind of saw about, contact your member of Congress. You and I have been up to the Hill enough to know that that actually does matter. That is, if there's enough people in a community who start, screaming about this and complaining, and how can you treat people like this and so forth, the only thing that most members care about is getting reelected. So the reality is, to the extent that you get people really talking about it, get people writing in their communities, write something in the local newspaper. My neighbor, 20 years, was hauled out of his house, and it was awful. And why are we doing this? What kind of country do we live in? I mean, this is a hardworking person. Americans need to hear those stories over and over and over again. People will have those stories. Go to the press. Go on a one-to-one level. If they know somebody in the press and they know something's happened, and I've told this to all the lawyers, we're not in a legal war, we're in a political war. And the political war requires Americans to hear the other side. All they've heard is the disinformation about immigrants. So, yes, I think hopefully they'll contribute to groups like Immigrants List, but they also can do an awful lot in their own communities by standing up for people who are fighting, because there are people who are out there already and they'll know who they are, or writing letters or handwriting letters and, calling them member of Congress. I mean, I think the new senator from Arizona needs to hear an awful lot about what he did on the bill.
So, couple questions. I know you have a lot going on in your life, so I don't want to hold you up much. One question was your book comes out in different colors. Um, and I was curious, did you ever, I think you did. Did you ever have an orange edition?
I did a
Okay.
number of years ago, but I picked the colors. This year, this color was,
It was
the
pink
Barbie color.
last. Yeah, pink.
This was the
Um,
Barbie year. Um, and, I always wanted it to be one volume, but unfortunately now you
well,
can't do it
Trump's
anymore.
trying to bring it back to one volume.
Yeah, exactly. That's what my friends say. Maybe when Trump gets finished, it'll be back to one volume, a very
Uh,
thin one volume. Um,
and so do you intend to ride out the next 4 years and keep doing what you're doing, or what's your future looking like?
well, I can tell you, the promotional material for this book was something I picked out, and it said "Immigrants are America," and it's on the hat and on the shirt, And so every time I walk on the beach, I wear my hat, and half of the people give me a thumbs up, and half of the people look at me like they want to kill me here in South Florida. So I think I'm doing something good just by
Yeah.
walking with a hat, right? But yeah, I'm going to keep doing it. I'm certainly going to finish the 20th edition. And then my hope is to write a book about the cases and about Haiti, what I did in representing Haiti. And because there's lots of stories there, and write about the Supreme Court cases and some of the other cases that I've done over the years, to write a book on it. Because I remember, Mo, as a young kid, I read two books that I remember, and one was Louis Nizer, My Life in Court, which was kind of a stupid book, but it was about all these cases, and it kind of interested me. And then, of course, I read Clarence Darrow for the defense, which most progressive lawyers sometime in their career have read. And maybe that's why I became a lawyer. I didn't start out as a lawyer. I went to graduate school. I was going to be a professor, and I was studying political philosophy, and then wound up going to law school. So maybe deep in the recesses there of my mind, those
You
books
are
had.
going to become
So
a
the my idea is to write a book about this. Maybe some young kid one day will become a great immigration lawyer. Who knows?
well. I have to again, thank you for joining me. The work you've done, and I think people see your name on a book, but they don't know the layers of what you've done, impact. The impact litigation you've been involved in, especially some of those cases you mentioned, like Jean v. Nelson and Commissioner v. Jean and McNary v. Haitian Refugee Center. It's had a widespread impact, and as a lawyer who's down doing the fight here in Arizona, I am truly appreciative that I can always pull out your book and at least show my clients in a very quick and easy way what it says in Kurzban's. I always feel like that's a good place to say, look, here are the basic provisions for A, B, and C, whether it be employment-based immigration, or if it's a question about adjustment of status for somebody who came in on on some sort of visa that may make it more difficult, diplomatic visa, something of that nature. It's always in there, or even the little charts, the citizenship charts. It's a nice thing just to have at your fingertips. And so I want to thank you
Thank
on
you.
behalf of myself and probably every other immigration lawyer out there.
Well, and I want to thank you, Mo, for saving my life when I was walking down the street with you in San
I
Francisco.
don't think I was just sitting there
Mo came out of
laughing
the
at you.
restaurant and
Yeah,
said,
I was
"Get
like, take your hat off. No, I had a moment like that too. I had a hat that said, make red hats wearable again. And I wore it. I wore it to a Harris waltz rally. Kamala was here in Arizona, and she was walking around that rally. A lot of people were looking at me with some dirty looks, and then eventually they would see that it doesn't say what they thought it said. And so at the end of the rally, I took the hat off and I showed it to Kamala, and I said, "Hey, Kamala, check out my hat." And she started cackling, laughing so hard. My producer just walked in and is pushing the mic closer to me. Do you want to say hi to Ira Kurzban? Come say hi. This is my daughter, Emma.
Oh, hi, Emma. Oh, that's why. What a name. I
Yeah,
love your name.
Emma Goldman. And now she's making a quick escape. But yeah, so people like you and I have to, rile up the masses on occasion, and it's worth it because you're getting, even by the simplicity of a hat or a shirt, you're getting a message out to people. And so again, I think that it's something that a lot of our youth needs to learn from, is that be bold.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm thinking of what you did in with Arizona's 1070. I mean, if it wasn't for Mo and helping people get organized, I mean, when you talk about what can people do, that's a perfect example. I mean, remember, we had a
Yeah.
bunch of
We
meetings
had
with
the event
people.
up in Phoenix and
Yeah,
everything.
I
Yep.
mean, so there's lots of things people can do, and if it wasn't for Mo getting involved when he did, I think we'd probably still have 1070.
I will take no credit for the demise of SB 1070. I'll let MALDEF and ACLU and
Um,
National Immigration Law Center, all those big organizations, AIC, they did all the dirty work. I just went on the news a lot and just talked crap about Jan Brewer. But anyways, I appreciate you. Thank you for joining me. And again, this is Ira Kurzban. He is a man of many trades, a jack of all trades, in the legal world, especially. And the organization that you should support is Immigrants List. And so thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Mo, and thanks for giving me the
No
opportunity.
problem.
And just tell all your listeners, go out there and keep fighting.
And this is the podcast called Immigration Ain't Easy, which it is 100% not easy. And thanks to Emma, who just made a cameo for producing
Yeah.
the show. So thanks a lot, Ira.
All right, be well. Thanks.